Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're talking about some of the scariest creatures from Greek mythology. These are the monsters that filled ancient stories with danger and mystery. Creatures like the Hydra with its many heads, the half-man, half-bull minotaur trapped in a labyrinth, and the fire-breathing chimera. Alongside the famous ones, there are also stranger, lesser-known beasts that challenged heroes and haunted the imaginations of the ancient Greeks. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're here to unwind, fall asleep, or just enjoy some old stories, I'm glad you're with me. Now, let's begin. The war that had toppled the Titans was meant to be the end. In the halls of Olympus, the new gods sat upon their thrones of gleaming marble and golden light. The Storm King Zeus triumphant with thunderbolt still warm in his hand. His brothers Poseidon and Hades carving their dominions of sea and underworld, while the others, fresh with victory, looked upon the world as theirs to order. The Titans, vast and ancient, had been overthrown, bound in unbreakable chains and hurled down into the black pit of Tartarus, where their cries echoed forever. It was said the gates of their prison were sealed by the 100-handed hecaton chairs, monstrous jailers who stood guard at the edge of the abyss, so that none of the elder race might ever climb back to the light of day. To the Olympians, the war was over. To Gaia, the mother of all, it had only just begun. Gaia, the earth itself, had watched as her titangent sons were cast down, as the world shook with the weight of their fall. She had given birth to them, nursed them, seen them rise against their father Uranus, and then again against the new order of Zeus. Twice her children had been taken from her, chained and cast beneath the ground she embodied. The anguish of a mother became fury, and fury gave way to vengeance. From the depths of her soil, from the blood spilled in the first wars of gods, Gaia brought forth a new race of avengers. They were called the Gigantes, the giants, towering beings with the might of mountains in their limbs. Some said their legs ended not in feet but in writhing coils of serpents, as if the earth's venom itself had shaped them. Others spoke of their hair bristling with wildfire, their eyes glowing like embers in the night. What all agreed upon was their hatred of Olympus. The Gigantomachy, the war of the giants, was a conflict not of mortals or kings, but of earth itself against the sky. The giants surged forth in a tide of rage, hurling boulders that split the heavens, tearing up whole mountains by their roots to use as weapons. Their voices were the roar of storms, their steps the tremor of earthquakes. They clawed at the very slopes of Olympus, seeking to drag the gods down into the dust. Against them, the Olympians marshalled all their power. Athena, grey-eyed and tireless, donned her war helm and raised her spear. Apollo's arrows, shafts of unerring light, struck through giant flesh. Poseidon heaved his trident and split the earth with waves of ruin. Zeus himself hurled thunderbolts that blazed brighter than noon, setting the battlefield aflame. Yet for all their might, the gods wavered, for prophecy had declared that the giants could not be slain by gods alone. Their blood, born of Gaia, was immune to divine hand unless joined by mortal strength. Thus came Heracles, the mortal son of Zeus, summoned to the field of gods, where gods and giants clashed in elemental fury. He stood among them with bow and club, bloodied but unyielding. One by one, Heracles brought down the champions of Gaia. He shot Alcyoneus, greatest of the giants. But when the monster fell, his body touched the earth and he rose again, immortal on his native soil. Guided by Athena, Heracles dragged him across the border into another land, and there slew him where Gaia's breath could not revive him. Porphyrion, another giant, sought to tear Hera from her throne, lust blazing in his heart, but Zeus struck him with a thunderbolt, even as Heracles' arrow pierced his side, ending him in a storm of fire and blood. Enceladus, their war leader, was hurled down and crushed beneath Sicily. His writhing body became the rumbling of Mount Etna, his fiery breath its ceaseless eruptions. Polybotes fled across the sea, but Poseidon tore a chunk of the island of Kos and crushed him beneath it, forming the Isle of Nisyros. The war was savage, long, and stained with terror. The sky itself seemed to bleed, and the mountains groaned beneath the struggle. Yet at last the giants fell, their bodies entombed beneath stone and sea. Greece's mountains, the ancients said, were not mere rock but the sepulchres of the slain giants, their restless groans still audible in quakes, their wrathful breath in sudden bursts of flame from the earth. To the gods it was victory. Olympus stood, its thrones unbroken, the new order secure. But to Gaia, defeat only hardened her hatred. Twice her children had been destroyed, the Titans chained, the giants buried, and still Zeus ruled above all. So she plotted once more. From her union with the abyss, from her fury and the pit of Tartarus itself, Gaia conceived a monster greater than Titans, more dreadful than giants, a creature whose name would chill even the gods who had triumphed twice before. The storm of storms, the dragon with 100 heads, the bane of Olympus, Typhon. Gaia did not forget. The chains that bit into the wrists of the Titans were sunk deep into the black floor of Tartarus, and the giants lay pressed beneath mountains and islands. Yet the Mother of Earth heard them in the stone and the soil. Their voices were dull and far away, like drum beats through the bedrock, and each echo was a wound. The halls of Olympus shone bright as burnished bronze. The gods in their triumph feasted and sang, and the world marched to a new order under the Thunderer. Gaia brooded in the caverns beneath all lands, where roots drink in the dark, and where even the gods dislike to send their sight. She had borne a race of kings and watched them flung into the pit. She had brought forth avengers and watched them buried where they fell. Fury is patient when it belongs to stone. She sought a champion who would not rely on ranks or banners, a single mountain of malice and will that could rise from the gullet of night and tear the pillars from the sky. She turned to Tartarus himself, the fathomless gulf that had swallowed her elder sons, and from that union of earth and abyss came a birth that shook the world. They named him Typhon, and the name was small beside the thing. He rose from the west like a weather front that blotted out the Sunday. His shoulders climbed into the cloud layer, and then above it, a living cliff wreathed in storm. From the waist downward, his body fell away into coils of serpent that looped and knotted upon the ground in rings as wide as valleys. His arms were pillars banded with scales that drank the light. Where a man would have a hand, he had talons that could sigh the forest in the space of a breath. And above those shoulders there was not one face and not merely a pair. A crown of dragon heads sprouted in a thicket, 100 throats, 100 jaws, 100 tongues that poured out different hells. One vomited fire so white it scalded the air, one steamed poison that turned the meadow to ash. One cried in the voice of lions and another in the chant of wolves, and there were calls like flensed metal and a keening like winter wind in a ruined temple. Wings unfurled from his back and beat until the sky roared with their passage, and the sea bucked on its shores as if trying to climb away from the land. The earth felt his feet as quakes, long and rolling. Volcanoes answered him with fountains of flame and stone. Rivers tried to change their courses and could not. The bronze gates of Olympus quivered on their hinges. The gods looked down from the mountain, and many who had not known fear since the age of Kronos tasted it on their tongues like copper. The poets who came after would say that some fled and wore other shapes. They told how Apollo leapt into the air and became a hawk, how Hermes lengthened into an ibis, how Pan took to the goat track and bounded for the high ridges, and how others rushed toward the Nile and put on the skins of sacred beasts to hide from that storm shaped like a man. These are tales heard in the marketplaces and the porches of old houses, and they carry the scent of Egypt about them. Yet they were told often enough that they rooted in the memory of men, whether the flight happened or whether the tale grew in the mouths of singers. There is no doubt that for a span of days, Olympus was a house under siege. Zeus did not run. He stood with the weapon that made him king. Lightning kissed his palm and grew in it. Thunder gathered about his shoulders like a cloak. He came down from the mountain, and the two great powers of the world met in a country that could not bear them. There was no parley. Zeus threw his first cast, and the bolt opened a dragon neck from gullet to crest and filled the wound with noon. Another throw, and another head burst in a shower of fire. Typhon screamed, and the hair on men rose, though they were 1,000 miles away. The monster ripped a ridge from the earth and hurled it. Zeus shattered it in the air, but the rain of stone was a storm that scoured hills. Seas boiled. Forests flashed to char. When Typhon spat rivers of black venom, the god answered with a sky of fire, and the clouds themselves burned until the world stood red and copper-coloured in a glow like the inside of a forge. Their battle drove east and south and west again, across plains and through mountain chains that still wear the scars. There came a turn. Even a king can misstep when he walks on blades. Zeus closed for the finishing stroke. Typhon's coils whipped, and the god felt weight around his limbs that was strong as fate. Talons clamped and would not let go. The 100 mouths laughed in a thunder that was colder than the grave. Typhon wrested the sickle that had once cut heaven from earth, and with that ancient edge he gashed the god and took from him what no spear had taken. The sinews that gave thunder its cast were cut away and bundled like a trophy, and Zeus fell, and the mountain heard him fall. Typhon dragged him to a cavern in the lands that face the rising sun, to Cilicia of steep gorges and high walls of stone. There he hid the stolen strength in the skin of a great bear, and he set a guardian over the prize. Some name the watcher Echidna, the serpent woman who shared his bed and who would later bear a murderous brood. Older mouths name her Delphine, a she-dragon whose lair stank of old blood and whose eyes never closed. The cave breathed damp and chill. Inside it, the lord of the sky lay as a man might lie when the tendon is torn from the bone, and there is no strength in the limb, and the pain is a red mist behind the eyes. Olympus waited. There are silences that hammer harder than drums. Then the servants of the high house dared the dark. Hermes, the quick-footed, moved as thieves move when the floorboards crack at every step, and with him went the goat-footed god of the wild, who is older than fear in the forest. They found the cavern by the stink of venom and wet fur. They watched the she-dragon turn her head this way and that, and they slipped like shadows that have no bodies. They took the hidden strength and bundled it tight and ran with it while the echoes in the cave still rolled back upon themselves. They came to the god and bound the strength back in the places it belonged. The sound that followed was like a storm remembering how to speak. Zeus rose. The air lightened as if the sky had taken off a weight. The mountain peaks stood a little straighter. He did not come back in anger that rages blind. He came back with the cold of a judge. He gathered the weather on his arm until the clouds shone white at the heart and black at the edge, and until the hailstones in the womb of the storm were as large as shields. He found Typhon where the land heaves up in Sicily and where the earth is cut with fire. The monster had torn trees out with their roots for clubs and had drunk from rivers as a man drinks from a cup. The closing was swift. Zeus cast and cast again and did not cease to cast. Bolts lodged in coils and burned. Bolts climbed the ladder of necks and exploded in mouths that had never tasted fear. The air screamed, and the ground did as well. When Typhon tried to fly, the storm pressed him down. When he reached to seize, the storm split his grasp. He toppled, and the fall made the sea step back from the shore. Zeus called up a mountain and threw it, and the weight of it pinned the monster where he lay. Some say the whole of Sicily lies upon him. Some say it is the cone of Etna alone, with its long flanks of ash and its black rivers of cooled stone. The truth men agree upon is this: fire still climbs from that peak in bright fountains, and the ground rumbles as if a chained thing strains in the dark, and the smoke rolls in columns when the world is quiet. The Greeks looked up and said that Typhon still breathes in his bed, and that when the mountain glows he is turning in his chains. The reign of Zeus endured, yet the victory was written in a hand that remembered how close the end had come. The gods sat again on their chairs of ivory and gold, and the bowls of nectar were filled, and the hymns rose. But there was a new caution in their songs. They had seen a strength that did not bow when thunder called. They had learned that the earth can still bring up a thing that asks questions only a lightning bolt can answer. Zeus had put down the greatest of the children of Gaia and Tartarus. He had also left a seed in the ground. The mother of monsters still lived, the serpent woman with the face of a nymph and the body of a snake, the mate of the storm thing who lay under the stones. In caves far from the roads men travel, she waited, and her womb remembered. Out of that waiting would come a line of plagues for heroes to meet, hounds with more than one head, lions whose hides turned iron under the knife, serpents that grew two for every one that fell, and chimeras that breathe war. The age of monsters was only beginning, and the tale of their births belongs to the next page. When the mountain cooled and the ash settled on the slopes of Etna, when the seabirds dared the air again and the shepherds crept back to count their flocks, there remained a silence beneath the land that was not peace. The god had flung a mountain upon the storm thing and bound him to the bedrock. Yet vengeance is a root that runs deep and does not die because the trunk has fallen. In the dark between stones, in the caves that drink the light and never grow full, a presence endured. She kept her own counsel and did not beat upon the walls as her mate did. She waited and she watched, and the earth knew her, for she was of it. The old poets speak of her with a shiver in the voice. They call her Echidna, and they do not linger over the name. Those who first told her story did so as men speak when they pass a barrow at night. They said she was two natures married in one body. From the waist upward she wore the beauty of a nymph, white-shouldered and lithe, with eyes that gleamed like wet stone. From the waist downward she fell away into coils of a great serpent, ring upon ring of scale the colour of old bronze, a tail that could circle a pillar and make it groan. She was ageless, and she did not die. Hunger was with her as faithfully as breath. She loved to feed, and she loved the taste of flesh. She did not wander. She chose a cave and made it a hall and a bed, and there she lay in the red glow of a banked fire, among bones and old iron, and the damp air smelled of venom and the last breaths of the prey that had come too close. Some named her daughter of sea-born powers, and some said she rose from earth and pit together. All agreed that she shared the bed of the buried storm, and that from that union would come a line of grief for the world. There is a tale that the Thunderer, who had laboured to bind Typhon, found Echidna in her hollow and weighed his hand. The god who had salted the sky with fire could have ended her. He set his will aside. The accounts say he stayed his blow so that the generations to come would know trial and prove themselves, that heroes might rise against terrors and be measured. Whether mercy or design ruled him, the choice left a seed in the dark. It sprouted, and the first shoot was the bark and snarl of a hound with more than one voice. Orthrus came first, a two-headed beast whose breath steamed in the cold and whose fangs were yellow with fat. He would go on to stand watch in the far west over a red herd and a three-bodied lord. Then came a greater hound, one whose name rattles the door of every tomb. Cerberus arrived yelping from the womb, each head its own hunger, a mane that writhed with little snakes like a crown that never slept, a tail that was a serpent with its own malice. He would be led in the end by mortal hands, but for an age his baying guarded the iron road and kept the living from the dead. Echidna did not rest. The cave grew warm with new breath. A serpent came forth next, a child of the marshes and the black water. The hydra of Lerna slithered into the reeds and made that country a blighted ring. The swamp held its lair as a mother holds a babe, and it grew on ruin. When a head was severed, the wound flowered with two more, and the air above its pool was sour with a poison that clung to flesh and wood and did not wash away. It was said that one head would not die at all, that it watched while the others fell, and that its life was buried under a stone by hands that had learned fire. The gods in their anger sent it as a scourge, and it was a good scourge, for it left scars that never healed on the spears and arrows it touched. From the same womb a stranger thing stepped into the light. The chimera came with a lion's mane about a brow that knew rage, with a goat's back rising in the middle, and with a serpent for a tail. Flame licked at its teeth and then roared in a clear, hard stream that turned men and cattle into bones where they stood. It grazed on smoke and slept on embers. There are old songs that say Orthrus lay with the chimera, and from that mating came two plagues. One was the Sphinx, who took a place above the road to Thebes and made knowledge and ignorance matters of life and death. She asked her question in a voice as smooth as oil and fed on the bodies of those whose mouths could not shape the answer she sought. The other was a lion whose hide turned the point from every spear and drank the light from blades. He took a country for his hunting ground and left mothers to tear their hair by the graves of sons. When the skin was finally won, it cloaked a man who did the work of the gods with mortal arms. Many more were counted among the brood, for the storytellers of old loved to bind fearful things in a single line. Some placed Ladon on Echidna's knee, the great dragon that wrapped itself around the bright apples in the far garden and never closed its eyes. Some numbered among her children the eagle that tore at the liver of the chained fire thief. Some put Scylla in her line and heard the barking of 6 hungry throats in the wash of a narrow sea. Others pointed to the dragon that slept coiled around a tree in the grove of the war god at the rim of the world where the fleece shone like sunrise, and said that snake too came from Echidna's cave. Whether all these births were hers, or whether poets built a single house for every terror, is a question for quiet rooms and long nights. What matters is that somewhere in the earth there was a mother, and that mother brought forth deaths for men to meet. There is an ending told in whispers. It says that the eye that never closes and sees in all directions found the cave and looked inside. Argus Panoptes, the many-eyed servant of a queen who cherished grudges, came upon Echidna while her lids were heavy and the banked coals were low. He drew his blade and set it where serpent scales meet the softness of a throat. In that, telling the cave takes its last breath, and the earth swallows the sound. Other mouths say she endured, and only her children went out into the light to die by the swords of men. In either case, the shape of the years that followed does not change. The brood was at large. The roads of Greece learned the pad of lion feet and the drag of immense bellies over stone. The mouths of harbours learned the voice of sea creatures that did not fear oar or sail. There were riddles in the way, and there were teeth in the dark. The age of monsters had begun its hard season, and men whose names still carry weight would lift clubs and bows against the things that had stepped from Echidna's womb. The cave that held Echidna grew busy with breath and heat, and from that dim hall the first children of the buried storm came into the light. Orthrus stepped out before the others, a great hound with twin skulls that watched in different directions and never tired of the task. His hide was thick as boiled leather, his jaws worked like iron traps, and the marks he left in the soil kept their shape long after rain. He took service in the far sunset country, with a lord who wore 3 bodies and 3 belts of bronze, and he learned the taste of strangers who came seeking a crimson herd. Close upon him came Cerberus, larger and louder, a watcher meant for a gate that never opens to the living. He possessed 3 ravenous heads, and a tail that moved with a will of its own, and along his shoulders a fringe of little serpents hissed at every shadow. The breath from his mouths carried the chill of cavern rivers, and his eyes shone the colour of furnace coals. When the gods spoke of the order of things, they counted him as the hinge upon which the world of light turns away from the land of shades. For his baying warned all who approached that the road downward was a one-way road. Another birth brought a length of scaled bodies that tangled upon themselves and wrote new lines across the marshland of Lerna. The hydra took the pool for a cradle and grew monstrous in its keeping. Its heads multiplied with violence, 2 rising where one had fallen, and its blood took all softness from the flesh it touched. The air above the reeds soured, and the reeds themselves blackened at the roots. Men who hunted along those banks learned that a single wound from the serpent meant an end that moved slowly and never relented. The tale that old singers preferred set an immortal head among the number, a watcher that would not die and that kept count as the others fell. They spoke of fire as the only cure for the necks that wept and flowered, and of a heavy stone laid upon the head that never closed its eyes. From the same womb there came a creature with 3 natures married in one body, a lion in the foreparts with a mane that sparked when it shook itself, a goat rising from the spine, and a serpent that coiled in place of a tail. The chimera exhaled a clear flame that ran straight and hard, and the glow of its lair could be seen from the hills at night. It ate herds and travellers alike, and the smoke of its meals stained the rock above its den. The brood learned cunning as well as hunger. The Sphinx took a seat on a rock beside the road to Thebes, and made the passage into a court. She had the body of a lion and the wings of a high roosting bird, and her face was a woman's face that smiled without warmth. She asked a single question and weighed the answers as a judge weighs the scale, and where the mind failed to answer, the body was forfeit. Ships learned fear as well, for along certain narrows the sea itself seemed to take shape and bite. In some tellings, the barking that echoed from a cliff was counted among the children of Echidna and Typhon, and sailors spoke of 6 long necks that darted from a grotto and snatched men from deck planks as a hawk takes mice from a field. Others placed that hunger in older waters and gave the sire and dam different names. Yet the terror for those who rode was the same, where the coast folded upon itself and the flood turned in a circle as if it wished to devour the world. Sailors saw the work of the same dark family, for the Greeks seldom split hairs when they named the children of fear. Guardianship pleased this line as much as raiding did. A sleepless serpent coiled around a tree in a grove sacred to the war god, and in its branches a fleece the colour of sunrise hung and tempted princes to their ruin. The coils hissed in the night without pause, and the eyes shone like drops of quicksilver. In the far west, another dragon lay around bright apples in a garden that breathed the perfume of evening, and every scale upon that dragon was a shield that turned blades. Some storytellers said the mother of monsters had brought those strangling lengths into the world. Others gave them to the old sea powers who loved to breed wonders. Yet all agreed that both serpents guarded prizes that could not be taken by strength alone. Far to the east and far to the west, the line of Echidna met the ambitions of men, and the names of men who tested those coils became measures of courage around the hearth. The land did not want for lesser terrors. A sow of prodigious size rooted in the hills near the Saronic Gulf, and left behind fields that looked as if armies had fought there. A bull in Crete tossed plough-stones as a child tosses pebbles and stamped orchards into chalk dust. In old genealogies, the sow and the bull were tucked into the same house that held the lion and the snake. For when the Greeks told the story of destruction, they liked its branches to meet at a common trunk. The eagle that tore at the rebel who had brought fire to men was mounted into the same family by some, for its appetite was tireless and its beak never dulled. The mouths that remember everything also whispered that a maiden who had the sea for a grandsire gave birth to Scylla, and that others claimed the serpent woman for the mother, and that both tales serve, since the fear felt the same when oar blades lifted and the cliff faces closed in. So the children went out into Greece and into the lands beyond Greece, and wherever a road narrowed or a river slowed or a pass climbed between 2 shouldered peaks, men began to speak of lairs and watch fires and the weight of eyes upon their backs. Farmers told their sons to be home by dusk and to keep to the path, and princes told their sons that a king has no right to crown or scepter if he cannot stand before something that the earth itself has thrown up against him. The gods looked on with a pride that kept its face stern, for they had allowed the mother to keep her place in the dark in order that the worth of men might be taken on a sounding line. From that decision came the catalogue of trials that still ring in the mouths of poets and craftsmen. A lion's pelt that knives cannot pierce, 100 throats that cannot be counted, except by the number of bodies left in their wake, a hound that will not let a soul slip by, a riddle that turns wisdom into bread for the living, a flame that eats stone. In time there were endings as well as births. Some said the watcher with many eyes came to the cavern when the serpent woman slept and laid a blade to the place between her scales. Some said she simply fell away into legend while her offspring played out their brief seasons in the Sunday. The one truth that remains is the march that followed. Names rose to meet the brood, men born of mortal wombs, who nonetheless carried themselves as if they had sprung from cloud or foam, and behind those men came the witnesses who set the tales into bronze and marble and painted clay. The children of Echidna made a field on which to test the mettle of the age, and that age answered with club and bow and with counsel taken at the right hour. The balance between fear and valor set the tone of the world that followed, a world where the house of Zeus held the heights, and where the earth still put forth reminders that its patience has edges. In the years after Typhon sank beneath the mountain and the brood of Echidna began to move across the face of Greece, there came a man whom kings feared to offend and whom monsters learned to dread. He did not walk with the quiet of a god who has never known pain. He carried the memory of a house stained with madness and a blood debt that could only be answered in toil. His father was Zeus, lord of thunder, and his mother was Alcmene of Thebes, a woman who kept her dignity when the will of the sky came down into her chambers. Hera bore the affront as only a queen can bear it, with a patience that sharpened itself into ruin. The child was named Heracles, the glory of Hera, a name that was a prayer offered toward a heart that would never soften. When he had grown broad in the shoulders and sure in his step, Hera drove a darkness into him, and he took his own children into death. When the darkness lifted, he saw what he had done, and the house shook with his grief. He went to Delphi to ask what the world demanded for such a stain. The oracle sent him to Tiryns to serve King Eurystheus for a long count of years, and to take upon his back a series of labors that would try sinew and soul. The monsters were already abroad. The gods watched with cool eyes to see what a mortal son would make of their tests. The first word from Eurystheus sent him north and west to a country of low hills and dark hollows where shepherds kept their fires high after nightfall. A lion had taken Nemea for its hunting ground. The people told of a beast of unusual size and cunning, a cat whose coat caught the last light of evening like hammered gold. Spears had snapped against its ribs and arrows had slid from its shoulders as if they had struck a bronze door. Men who hunted in groups found only bodies when the hunt was over, and men who hunted alone were found only in pieces if they were found at all. Heracles came into that land with a bow of great curve, a club of tough wood that had been seasoned in smoke, and a patience that was heavy and uncomplaining. He walked the ridges until he found the spoor, and he followed the track into a country of broken stone where caves gape like old wounds. There was a cavern with two mouths, and the lion kept it as its den. Heracles walked the ground and learned the way the slopes fell and where a man could place his feet without a sound. He cut a slab of rock and rolled it until it pressed one mouth of the cave shut. Then he stood at the other opening and set an arrow to string. The shaft struck the beast and bounced from its hide as if it had hit the shell of a turtle. The lion came roaring out through the dark, and the air filled with its breath and its hunger. Heracles cast the bow aside and gripped the club with both hands. He struck once, and the sound rang along the rock like a bell in a tower. The beast staggered and leapt, and the two fell together into a wrestling that ground dust from the stone. Heracles locked his arms around its throat and pressed until the last air left it, and the great limbs stopped clawing for purchase. He did not rise for a long time. At last he stood and set himself to flaying, and he found that no knife could cut the hide. He took the lion's own claws, and with them he opened the skin as a tailor opens heavy cloth. He wore the pelt across his shoulders with the head for a hood, and the hide took on the work of armor. When he came to Tiryns in that war dress, Eurystheus looked from the safety of a storage jar and measured out the next task with a shaking hand. The second word sent him south to a place where the water sits and does not move, and where reeds rise like spears from black mud. The marsh of Lerna lies low, its pools rimmed with shadow even at noon, and there the people spoke of an old thing that had lived among them as long as grandfathers remembered. They named it the Hydra. They said it had many heads that never ceased to watch, and that when one head fell, two rose from the blood. The breath that came from those gaping mouths ruined wood and leather and turned the throat of a man to fire. Heracles came down to the swamp's edge, and he called to his kinsman Iolaus to drive his chariot and keep to him. The beast rose from the reeds at the sound of the wheels, coils slapping water into the air, a wreath of heads weaving and tasting the wind. Heracles planted his feet in the sucking mud and brought the club down with the steadiness of a carpenter who will never live to see his work rot. A skull burst like a pot, and two wet buds pushed from the torn neck at once. He cut again and again, and each time the wound multiplied. The swamp rang with hissing and the splash of heavy bodies. Wisdom is a tool as sure as iron. Iolaus leapt down and kindled a fire, and when Heracles struck a neck, Iolaus laid the brand to the raw place. The flesh sealed and did not flower. Head after head fell and did not grow. Hera sent a crab of great size clattering through the shallows to clutch at the hero's heel. He stamped and broke the shell and felt the joint give under his heel, and the crab sank. The heads thinned. Only one remained that would not learn the lesson of flame. The old telling says that this last head had no ending within time. Heracles put the club aside and took a sword and cut clean. He lifted the head while it screamed, and he set a broad stone upon it where the marsh meets the firm earth. Then he and Iolaus went about the labour of fire until the great length of the serpent lay still among the reeds. Heracles drew a knife, dipped it into the black blood, and then drew each of his arrowheads through that poison. The barbs took the stain and kept it. In the years that followed, the point struck deep and the wound was never clean. When he brought news of the deed to Tiryns, there was murmuring in the high rooms. Eurystheus counted the labour, but kept a book within a book. There were whispers that a task done with a helper is a lesser thing, that the fire belonged to Iolaus's hand, and therefore the trial must be weighed differently. The reckoning of the labours would lengthen, and the number that singers chant would grow more than expected, yet the world did not care for the arithmetic of kings. In the towns where men woke in the night to the sound of their own breath, in the farms where children looked down the lane before stepping into dusk, the news that the Hydra lay dead spread like spring. The marsh kept its stink, but lost its terror. The people of Nemea lifted their heads. A man had gone out against the children of the cavern, and had come back with a pelt that turned blades, and with arrows that could bring an end no healer could cure. The season of monsters had met the first true hand that could close it, and yet the list on Eurystheus's clay tablets had only begun to unroll. Herds would change their paths when he passed, and kings would look over their shoulders when they spoke his name. There is a hardness that settles on a man who has strangled a lion in the dark and has breathed the stink of a marsh while serpents beat at his chest. Heracles wore that hardness like a second hide. He had learned that there are caves with two mouths, and that one may be sealed if a man is willing to blister his palms on stone. He had learned that some wounds do not heal unless fire teaches them the lesson. He had learned that the gifts of the gods are tools that demand sweat. In the lanes of Tiryns, the boys once played at his story, and the old men sat at doors to listen. In the barrens near Lerna, the wind combed the reeds that now had no master. In Nemea, the shepherds counted their flocks and reached the true number. Above them all, the gods still watched, and Hera's eyes did not leave him. The board was set for further trials. The bow hung ready, the club leaned against the wall, and the lion's head stared where he stared. The skin of the Nemean beast still smelled of smoke and marsh water when the next summons came, and the writing of Eurystheus sent Heracles over the wine-dark sea to the island where kings traced their line to old bulls and older seas. In Crete, a snow-bright animal had once risen from the surf as a sign to a ruler who bargained with the gods and then thought to keep what was owed. The white bull walked the fields like a storm that had taken a shape. It tore the furrows with its hooves and threw men and stone fences into the air as if they were reeds. The houses on the low hills kept their shutters closed, and the priests muttered at altars that had seen more than one broken promise. Heracles came without fanfare and followed the ruin through vineyards and dry gullies until he sighted the glimmer of that hide in the early light. He did not reach for poisoned arrow or bronze. He set his feet, met the charge, and closed his arms around the neck until the world narrowed to the bellows of his own lungs and the animal's breath hot against his cheek. He forced it down in a long heave and tied it with cords of cowhide. He brought the bull across the sea on a creaking deck that smelled of salt and fear. And when he hauled it before Eurystheus, the king would not come near, and soon ordered it loosed. Freed, the bull went north to the Attic plain and wandered the country of Marathon, where another prince would one day bring it down at the altar. The island remembered the day the stranger wrestled its omen into halter and line, and the mainland learned that even a sign from the sea can be led if a man's grip is sure. There were no gifts in the next errand. It pointed Heracles to Thrace, where winter bites harder and where iron glints on more men than ploughshares. Diomedes ruled there, a son of the war god who loved the sound of chains and kept 4 mares in a stable that stank of offal and fear. They were fed on flesh and grew sleek on the screams of travellers and slaves, their lips peeled back from long yellow teeth that clicked like shears. Heracles came ashore with a few friends and took the reins from the grooms, and for a time it seemed a task of hands and rope and strong backs. Then the king's men came in a wave, and there was shouting and the clash of bronze on seasoned wood, and in the swirl a young companion named Abderus was left to hold what could not be held. The mares dragged him across the yard and tore him until there was nothing left to carry home. Heracles saw the ruin, and his eyes went cold as winter glass. He fought through the ring of shields until the son of Ares stood before him. He struck Diomedes down, and with the swiftness of judgment he threw the carcass to the very animals that had fed on other men. They learned the taste of their master and went quiet. Heracles bound their jaws and led them south to Tiryns. Eurystheus sent them away, and they roamed the fields until wild beasts found them, and the name of Abderus remained on the wind in that place. There are towns that grew from grief, and Abdera is counted among them, for men do not forget the price that is paid in the shadow of a stable. Labours lengthened like a road that keeps climbing. The next command reached farther than any man's memory could measure, across the end of the world where the day itself seems to die. There lay Erythea, a red island set in the Western Ocean, where a giant named Geryon kept a herd whose hides shone like blood at sunset. The giant was said to be three-bodied from the waist up, with 3 shields and 3 spears and 3 grim faces under one helm, a sight to try the heart of any who lived by a single pulse. To reach that shore, a man would go mad with oars before he left the sight of land. Yet Heracles walked south and west again until the sun itself took pity. Helios saw him stride through the desert at noon and gave him a golden cup boat, broad of beam and bright as a coin just struck, and in that vessel Heracles crossed the bounds that sailors fear to name. On the Red Island a 2-headed hound came first. Orthrus, brother to Cerberus, watchful and close to the scent of blood, and Heracles broke its skull with one blow of the club that had already tasted lion and serpent. The herdsman Eurytion ran with a spear and fell in his turn. Then the giant came, armed in 3 ways and shouting in 3 voices, and Heracles took up the bow that had learned the lesson of learner. The arrow flew straight, and the poison ran like night through the bodies it touched, and the giant went to earth in one long fall that shook the pasture. With patient hands Heracles gathered the cattle and turned them toward the dawn. The drive home was a story of long horizons and small violences. In a cave above the Tiber, a fire thief named Cacus tried to steal the herd by dragging the animals backward so that their tracks pointed the wrong way. The lowing gave him away, and the rock split when Heracles struck it, and Cacus died amid the smoke of his own hearth. At the narrow place between 2 continents, the hero raised pillars on either shore, and there the sea runs fast to this day. He moved through lands that did not know his language, yet learned his name. At last the red hides shone on the slopes above Tiryns, and Eurystheus took them and made a sacrifice to the Queen of the Heavens, whose anger had set so much of this in motion. The cup of the sun returned to its master, and the taste of the far sunset lingered in the mouth of Greece. There remained the journey that no living man makes, and returns in the same skin. To bring the hound of Hades into the light was a word that sounded like blasphemy when it was first spoken. Heracles prepared as men prepare for winter, with rites and quiet and a tightening of the heart. He went to Eleusis and took the mysteries that teach the living how to walk among the dead without forgetting the names of the gods. He found the mouth in the south where a cave drinks the sea wind at Tyanarum, and there Hermes, the guide of souls, walked at his side, and Athena stood near with the calm of a sister who has seen many storms. The air grew colder than mountain dawn. The shades gathered like fog from the floor of a river valley. When he reached the iron gate, he did not draw sword or nock arrow, for the rule was made clear by him who ruled below. Hades would yield his hound only if the man who asked could master it with empty hands. The thing that guarded the threshold was bred for a duty that never ended. 3 heads swung on a single neck, and each set of jaws held teeth long as fingers. The mane crawled with small serpents that hissed and tasted the air, and from the rump another serpent uncoiled and watched with its own slow malice. The eyes burned in the gloom like coals under ash. The earth trembled when it came forward, and the breath from its mouth smelled of damp stone and old blood. Heracles stepped into the reach of those necks and caught them as they struck, one arm hard around a throat, one hand in a jaw that tried to close, one knee braced against the chest that heaved like a bellows. He took the claws against his shoulder, and he did not let go. The hound fought, and the cave roof shed dust as if it were snow, and then the great forelegs lost their strength and the heads sagged like banners at dusk. Heracles bound the beast and turned for the light. The dead gave way before him, as reeds give way when a boat glides among them, and the air warmed with each step toward the mouth of the world. When he came to Tiryns bearing the guardian of the underworld, the man he served looked once and hid in a jar as a child hides behind a door. The hound's eyes took the sun and narrowed, and the small serpents in its mane curled tight and went quiet. Heracles did not linger. He carried the creature back the way he had come and gave it to its master, as a guest is returned after a visit. The road between the living and the dead closed like a seam when the needle has passed. The tale of that passage went out across Greece and farther still, and men who took oaths in the name of Heracles did so with new weight in their voices. Eurystheus kept his tallies and argued in whispers about which task counted and which must be replaced, and in the end the number reached its fated sum, and the labours were declared completed. Yet the man who had walked through darkness and returned with the leash of the gatekeeper did not lay down his weapons. The world held other monsters and other kings, and the bow still slept with its poison, and the club still leaned where his hand could find it in the dark. The season of Heracles had entered its high noon, and the land bore the marks of his passing in broken cairns and emptied lairs, and in the quiet fields where flocks could graze without counting the shadows. Mothers taught their sons the names of the places where he had stood. Priests told the stories at festivals where bulls lowed and wine ran red in bowls. The gods watched from the blue vault, and some smiled and some did not. For a time Greece knew a measure of safety that comes when one man is willing to take the road that leads into caves and marsh and the mouth of death. That safety would never be complete, and it was never meant to be. The age of monsters had more to say, and there were other names that would rise on the breath of storytellers when the fire burned low. Long before the age of siege walls at Troy, before the poets learned the names of the men who burned that city, a different story moved over the islands of the Aegean. In Argos, a king named Acrisius heard a prophecy that chilled his marrow. The voice that speaks from beneath laurel leaves told him that his daughter would bear a son who would bring about his end. Such men believe they can bargain with fate by cruelty. Acrisius built a chamber of bronze and shut his daughter Danae within it, far from the eyes of suitors and the hands of men. Gods are not kept by locks. Zeus poured down as a shower of gold, and Danae conceived. When the child was born, she hid him at her breast and named him Perseus, and for a time the secret held. Then the king saw the truth in the light on the boy's face. He dared not kill the pair outright, for blood calls blood, and the gods look hard at those who spill it. He chose another road. He set mother and child in a chest and flung it upon the sea. Salt and tide judged them more kindly than kin. The waves carried the box to Seriphos, where a fisherman named Dictys found it in his nets and took them in with a gentleness that kings rarely show. On that island time hardened the boy into a youth with a straight back and a gaze that did not fall, and as he grew his mother's beauty drew the hunger of Polydectes who held the scepter there. The man wore a smile that did not reach his eyes. He cloaked his purpose in feasts and talk of gifts, and in the hearing of men he set himself a bride price that no fisherman could pay. He wanted Danae, and he wanted the sun out of his path. Men who rule small islands learn to make their schemes look like games. He spoke of horses to be given for the hand of a princess far away, and when the hall filled with boasting, Perseus said he would bring whatever gift was named if the king desired it. Polydectes asked for the head of Medusa, and the hall grew still. The word was a tide-drawn breath. There were 3 Gorgons who dwelt near the edge of the world, 2 immortal and 1 doomed to die. Medusa was the mortal sister, and she had once been fair, but in the anger of Athena she had been changed. In older mouths she is already a terror, with living serpents for hair and a face that turns the living to stone with a look. In the books of the learned, it is told that Poseidon wronged Athena by spilling lust within her temple, and that the goddess laid the mark of that sacrilege upon the woman's head. The sea remembers, and so do the gods who own the walls of their houses. However that change came, the thing that resulted had a gaze that stopped a heart and a beauty so ruined that stone envied it. Perseus walked out from Seriphos with the smell of the harbour rope in his clothes and the weight of a promise on his shoulders. Athena came to him with a shield polished bright as still water, and told him to look only into that calm. Hermes put winged sandals in his hands and set a curved blade upon his belt that cut what bronze could not. The nymphs gave him a pouch to carry what no man should hold in the naked hand, and the helm of the Lord below that casts a shadow over the wearer and makes him a rumour instead of a man. First he went to the Grey Sisters, who were elder than memory. The Grey sat upon a rock and shared between them a single tooth and a single eye. He watched the passing of that eye from hand to hand, and in the moment when none of them could see, he took it and held it gently until they told him what he needed. From them he learned the path to the dwelling of the Gorgons, where sea foam climbs a black shore, and the wind forgets to sing. He came upon their caverns in the hush that belongs to the hour before dawn. Serpents whispered against stone. 1,000 stone men kept their vigil in a ring around the lair, each with the last thought still written on his mouth. He crept like a hunter who knows the temper of his prey. He fixed his gaze upon the goddess's mirror and walked by the light it gave. In that curved bronze he saw the reflection of a face that once had been a maiden's face and was now a rictus crowned with living coils. Stheno and Euryale slept with their wings folded under them and their breath stirring the sand. Medusa slept as well, and even in that stillness the strands of her hair moved and tasted the air. Perseus came near. His left arm lifted the shield that had become his moon. His right hand brought the blade in a clean bright arc, and the sound was like a harp string plucked once in a deserted hall. Blood leapt and did not fall like other blood. From the wound sprang a winged horse with a mane like a froth line on the sea, and beside it a warrior with a golden sword. Pegasus and Chrysaor, children sired in an older quarrel, who chose that moment to be born. The immortal sisters woke to the smell and the change in the air. They screamed and beat their wings and gnashed their tusks. Perseus did not meet their eyes. He slid the head into the sack that the nymphs had given and called on the cap that hid him. The sand flew, and the wind found its voice again, and when the sisters clawed the place where he had stood, there was only empty stone and the sound of wings that were not theirs. The road home from the very end of the world is long enough to gather other stories. The young man moved along the rim of Libya and the waterline of Egypt and the rough coasts that face the rising Sunday. There he saw a city leaning under the weight of a god's displeasure. Cassiopeia had boasted that her beauty outshone the daughters of the sea, and the Nereids carried the insult into the deep where the trident rules. Poseidon sent flood and famine, and a serpent of the outer ocean to take what his anger demanded. The people cried to oracles and received a single hard answer. The king was to bind his daughter to the rocks and give her to the beast. Tresses torn by salt wind, wrists bruised by iron. A princess who had known silk and song stood against the stone and felt the tide climb. They named her Andromeda, and in that name there is a sound like nobility dragged across sand. Perseus saw her from the air where the sandals held him and dropped to a ledge where the spray leapt. He did not speak first. He cut the shackles and set his cloak about her shoulders, and then asked the cause of such a cruelty. Her father came running with a long procession of priests and fearful men, and made an oath upon the sea that he would give the stranger his daughter if he could turn back the doom. The horizon changed shape and the water rose before the beast itself was seen. The sea monster came on like a moving reef, jaws wider than city gates, scales thick as shields on a wall. There are tellings where the youth fought with sword and spear and made wounds that only angered the thing and brought it close enough for the final stroke. There are tellings where he called upon the only weapon in the world that does not know defeat. He stood on a wet shelf of stone while the water roared around his legs and drew the bundle from his belt. He did not lift the head to his own gaze. He unwrapped it and showed it to the face that rose from the deep. The scream stopped as if a hand had closed upon it. The wave hung and did not fall. Scales became stone, then fin and mouth and eye. The cliff was lengthened by the shape of a monster, and the spray flashed in a still arc like a carving. Andromeda's father kept his oath, and the young man took the young woman's hand, and the people who had wept on the beach found their voices for praise. There was blood yet to be shed before joy could stand upright. Andromeda had been promised to another, and men who count their claims by years do not easily yield them to a stranger who has come down from the sky. In the hall where the wedding wine stood ready, spears rose, and the floor rang with the stamp of heels. When the press grew thick and the shouts could no longer be told apart, Perseus lifted the bag once more, and the quarrel ended with a silence that lives forever. He did not linger in the land that had asked a daughter for its redemption. He sailed east with a bride who had learned how cold a sea wind can feel on bare skin, and who had seen a god change a shore into a statue. At Seriphos the island had grown smaller while he was away. Polydectes still smiled when he spoke of gifts and oaths, but the room around him was colder and the doorways narrower. Danae and Dictys had taken refuge at an altar because a man who keeps a court can be more dangerous than any beast. Perseus walked into that hall and did not waste words. He called upon those who had applauded the jest to step close and look upon the prize they had demanded. He opened the sack. Men who had made a game of terror learned its truth. When the king and his companions had become a ring of shapes whiter than sea chalk, Perseus lowered the head, called for the fisherman, and set him upon the chair that had belonged to his brother. Then he took ship again, for the road that began with a chest on the waves had another reckoning to make. Argos waited. Acrisius had left his city and wandered under another name, because prophecy follows a man even when he walks backward. In Thessaly there were games held in honor of a dead king, and Perseus came among the athletes and threw the discus as strong men will do. The wind turned and fate turned with it. The rounded stone flew low and found an old man among the watchers, and the old man fell, and the prophecy that drove this tale from the first bronze chamber was fulfilled. Perseus mourned the fallen and made rites for him with all honor, and the land knew that the gods measure their words. In the years that followed he founded Mycenae among the rounded hills, a city that would one day give kings to the great war. As for the head that had ended so many boasts and battles, he carried it to Athena, who set it upon her shield, and made of it a terror that guards temples and cities. The serpents hissed there forever, and men who looked upon that gaze learned that some faces are given back only by the bronze that reflects them. So the tale of Perseus runs from a locked chamber through the wine-stained halls of island kings, to caverns where monsters sleep, and to shores where a woman waits on a rock while the sea climbs to claim her. The line of his deeds crosses the map like a thread that binds coasts that do not speak to one another. It leaves behind stone where men once shouted, and it leaves behind a woman whose name sits forever beside salvation. It leaves behind a city set upon hills, and a goddess with a new emblem on her arm. The age of monsters has many faces and many hands. Here is a face turned to stone, and here is a hand that did not tremble when it lifted the mirror that made the killing stroke possible. The old kings of Crete told a story that began with a promise broken on a shore where the sea speaks in a deep voice. Minos asked the god of the waters for a sign to gird his claim to the throne. Poseidon sent him a bull gleaming white in the spray, a creature meant to walk only once from the surf and then to smoke upon an altar. Minos looked upon that perfect hide and kept it for his herds. The god looked back from the deep and remembered. From the memory came a punishment that shamed a palace. The queen Pasiphae felt a madness that carried her into the pastures. The craftsman Daedalus whispered the skill of wood and leather and hidden wheels, and from his hands came a device that fooled the bull and fulfilled the curse. From that union of royal blood and sea-born fury a child came squalling into the world. They named him Asterion in secret, and did not speak the name in the courts. He grew with a body like that of a man and a head that bore the fury and hunger of a bull. The palace shuddered at his cries, and Minos turned again to Daedalus and asked for a prison that could hold shame itself. The craftsman laid out a plan and raised corridors that turned upon themselves until men lost their minds in them. He called it the labyrinth. In its heart, the child of Pasiphae found his lair and learned the taste of flesh. A debt was laid upon Athens that fed the maze. The island prince Androgeos, son of Minos, went to the mainland and won every contest of strength at the games. Jealous rage rose in men who could not bear their losses. Androgeos died on that foreign soil, and whether a wild bull gored him or a plot cut him down, the father counted it murder. Minos sailed with a fleet and set a siege of the spirit upon a proud city. Famine and plague walked the streets, and the oracle spoke out of the god's house with a single demand. Athens would send each cycle a tribute of youths and maidens to Crete. 7 boys and 7 girls would stand before the door of the labyrinth, and the guards would open the door, and the sounds that followed would be heard only by the stones. The cycle came round like a season. Mothers cut their hair in the temples, and fathers looked upon the sea and cursed it. The names of the chosen were written with tears. In that city a prince grew to manhood, while the tribute lines lengthened. Theseus was the son of Aegeus, king of Athens, and of Aethra of Trozen. Some said the sea god also claimed the boy when he was conceived beside a quiet shore, for Greek tales often seat a child upon 2 chairs. What mattered in the end was the gait of the young man, and the way his hand found a weapon without fumbling. When the 3rd ship was fitted for the voyage of mourning, Theseus stepped forward and spoke in a clear voice in the assembly. He would sail with the doomed and end the tribute. He promised his father to raise a white sail upon his return. so that the old man watching from the headland would know joy instead of grief. The oars bit the water and the black sail bellied as the wind freshened, and the women on the quay pulled their veils across their faces. Crete received him with cold ceremony and hidden eyes. Minos held his court in the palace of Knossos, where frescoes showed leapers turning over the backs of bulls in a dance that pretended mastery. There moved also a girl whose gaze did not always turn where her father pointed. Ariadne was the daughter of the king, and she possessed a mind that weighed consequences and refused to be frightened by them. Night fell, and she went to Theseus in secret. She carried a sword and a ball of thread, and with them the memory of a plan. "Tie this to the doorpost and let it run behind you," she said, "and the path out will hold you by the waist when the dark tries to swallow you." Theseus took the gifts and the pledge that travelled with them, and the moon climbed the stone shoulders of the palace, while the guards unbarred the door that smelled of limestone and old blood. The labyrinth breathed a cold breath when he went in. The walls sweated in the dark, and the floors held prints that would never dry. The thread whispered over stone as it paid out, patient and sure. Theseus walked forward without haste, his hand upon the sword that remembered the warmth of Ariadne's palm. The air changed and carried the scent of a beast that devours what it does not fear. The sound came next, a lowing that rolled down the corridors like thunder heard from very far away. In a wide chamber at the maze's heart, the prince saw the creature that had unmade so many families. The Minotaur stood with its great head tossing, the mane clotted, the eyes wet and furious. Muscles rolled under a hide, toughened by years in the dark. The first rush broke against stone as the man stepped aside. The second brought him within reach. Steel met flesh. The blade bit at the neck and the shoulder, and the man moved in close where horns cannot find their turn. He took blow for blow and cut again until the great animal fell to its knees and then to its side. The cry that followed was longer than a man's breath and heavier than a bell. When it ended, the ground did not tremble any longer. He stood alone with the dead thing and wiped the sword on the matted hair. He gathered the thread and followed it back through turns that would have swallowed the sun if it had entered there. The door opened upon a courtyard where dawn had made the tiles wet with dew. Ariadne stood there with her hands tight around themselves, and behind her the captives who had expected to die stared as if the air had just learned a new trick. There was no time for triumph. Theseus led them to the harbour, and the oars dipped with a silence that carried fear and hope in equal measure. The ship slipped out under morning light, while the palace slept off its wine. They made Naxos before sleep caught them. The stories change in this place like a tide that turns twice in one day. Some say a god stood upon the shore and claimed the girl who had betrayed her father for the sake of a stranger, and that the god set a crown among the stars and called it a gift. Some say the prince left in the night, as men sometimes leave when they cannot carry both love and purpose. The truth is that Ariadne's name sank into the island's soil, and the ship that bore Theseus rose upon the sea without her. The wind carried them north. The prow kissed Attic water again, and the headland that bore the watchfires climbed into view. Old Aegeus had kept his vigil. Each day he climbed to the rock above the harbour and swept the horizon. He had set a sign with his son that would spare an old heart a mortal blow. When the ship rounded the point, the men aboard were singing, and the deck was bright with faces that had expected the dark. Yet the mast carried the colour of the first sailing, and the square of cloth was black as morning. whether joy unsteadied the prince so that he forgot the promise, or whether the wind tore the white sail from its place and the crew could not make it good in time, the result was the same. Aegeus saw the colour, stepped to the edge, and let the sea take him. The water that closed over him learned his name and keeps it still. Theseus entered the city with the weight of both victory and loss upon him. He put aside the foreign tribute and gathered the scattered hamlets of Attica under one name. He set order in the ways of sacrifice and in the paths of roads and courts. He hunted down a bull that had wandered from Crete years before and brought it to an altar to end its roaming. He ruled a time and became thereafter a measure by which Athenians judged their sons. Yet all of that came after a young man followed a thread into the heart of a maze and killed a thing that had no place in the daylight. There are men who enter the wide road of legend by way of an error they cannot undo. In the green city that looks down upon the Saronic waters, a youth of noble birth shed blood that should not have been shed. Bellerophon fled the stain and sought cleansing from a king who kept his court in Tiryns where the walls lift like cliffs. The king's lady looked upon the guest with eyes that asked for what honour forbids, and when the youth refused, the whisper became a cry. The king put a tablet in Bellerophon's hands, sealed with marks that spoke death in the lines of the letters, and sent him away to Lycia across the sea. Iobates ruled there, and when he broke the seal and read, he weighed the face of the stranger and chose a road that let him sleep at night. He bade the guest live as his guest and then set him a task that would end him without the need for murder. The beast that burned the farms of Lycia would be his trial. If the gods loved him, they would show it. The old men spoke the name of the monster as if it smoked on their tongues. They called it Chimera. They said its forequarters were a lion with the neck and mane of a king of cats, that from its spine rose a goat with a bearded face and blank eyes, and that a serpent coiled where a tail should be. There was fire in the mouth, and the breath ran like a white lance that drilled stone. The thing ranged among the high valleys, and the flocks broke from the slopes like water when it passed. Bellerophon begged a sign of favour before he went to meet it. In the night Athena came with a bridle that shone like dew, and told him to lay it on the head of a horse that was born from blood upon a shore far away. At daybreak he found the winged horse at a city fountain where girls came with jars to lift water. He stepped softly as a shepherd steps in lambing time, spoke to the bright creature as if it were kin, set the bit in its mouth, and felt the great body still under his hand. Pegasus bent his knees and let the man mount. The hunt took the pair into rough country where the ridges lie like the backs of sleeping beasts. From above, the lair showed as a black wound in the slope, and the smoke that wound from it was thick as wool. Bellerophon circled and the horse held steady, turning on the air as a hawk does when it waits for the rabbit to break cover. The monster came out and raised its heads to taste the wind. The first pass with the spear taught the rider the reach of the flame. He felt his skin dry in the heat and smelled the singe on the hair of his arms. He rose high and thought with the cold that comes to men who have come close to dying and tasted how simple the distance is between breath and none. When he dived again, he drove a great lump of soft metal upon the point of his spear into the furnace of the lion's mouth. The fire that made a weapon of the beast became its doom. The metal ran in a shining stream and choked the throat and gutted the breath. The forequarters sagged and the goat moaned and the serpent thrashed. The horse lifted hard and the rider struck again until the ridge fell silent but for the hiss of cooling stone. Iobates hoped once that the chimera would finish what a king's honor would not allow him to begin. When word came of the carcass smoking in its cave, he set other trials before the man who had taken to the sky. Bellerophon rode against the Solymi, who loved to fight upon the high ground where men slip and fall. He went against the women whom the world names as Amazons, and left their shields in rows upon the sand. He survived an ambush laid by the best men in Lycia, and when he returned to the palace, the king laid aside fear and calculation, and gave him his daughter and half his rule. The story could have ended in a house filled with sons, and in the steady work of a just reign. Pride in men who have looked down upon clouds grows as ivy grows when no knife trims it. The rider wished to place his feet upon a floor where only gods walk. He turned Pegasus upward, and the white horse climbed into air so thin that a man's chest becomes a furnace bellows. Zeus looked once and sent a stinging fly to speak for him. The horse shuddered, the bit rang as teeth clamped on it, and the man slid. Pegasus gained the stables of heaven. Bellerophon struck earth and bones broke like pottery. He lived and walked with a crooked step among fields where boys whispered his name as they drove lean sheep for pasture. He had killed the fire that burned in a monster's throat, and for that the world remembered him, even as it forgot how his hands shook when he tried to lift a cup. The road that climbs to Thebes passes under a rock where buzzards circle and bones grow white. In the days after Laius broke the laws of guest friendship and drew the anger of gods and men upon his house, a punishment came upon the city that was colder than plague and slower than siege. A creature took possession of the pass and turned the way into a court where travellers stood before judgment. The Sphinx crouched upon the rock, her haunches heavy with the strength of a great cat, her wings folded and smelling of old feathers, her woman's face lovely and terrible in its calm. Her eyes were old as rain, and her smile did not move when men wept. She asked a single question, and there was no knife that could cut it in two. Those who answered wrongly fed her, and the path below her rock shone with grease. Prophecy laid its weight upon the city in the same season. It was told that Thebes would not know peace until a man came who could answer what no one had answered. Oedipus walked toward that place while dust rose around his ankles. The man's life was a web of words spoken before his birth. A father had tried to kill him and failed. A shepherd had given him to another house. A drunken voice at a feast had told him that he was not his father's son. The young prince ran from a fate he carried within him, and met an old man at a narrow place where wheels and tempers do not easily pass. The old man died on that road, and Oedipus went on with blood in the lines of his hand. When he saw the rock and the figure upon it, he climbed until the sun was at his back, and the wind smelled of carrion. The riddle has been carried in the mouths of men so long that even children can sing it. What creature goes upon 4 in the morning, upon 2 at noon, and upon 3 in the evening? The ones who came before Oedipus stared at the ground and felt their throats harden. They spoke answers that sounded wise in the air and brittle upon the stone, and then they fell into the shadow of the wings. The man from Corinth who had no father he could name lifted his eyes and answered with the quiet of someone who has walked in many shapes already. He said the word that drew infancy and strength and age into one circle. He named the being that crawls, that walks, and that leans upon a stick when the light grows long. The Sphinx listened to the truth, and there was no room left in her for breath. She gathered her feet under her and cast herself down from the rock, and the ground leapt up and ended her. The pass opened. The city felt air move through it as a house does when a door that has long been shut is unbarred. Thebes made a king of the man who had freed it. They brought him to a woman who had been a queen, and they set a crown upon his head and placed his hand in hers. The riddler's corpse cooled in dust while the city sang. The story that followed is heavy and full of the sound of cloth being torn. The dead who fell from that unravelling belong to another page. For this page, the thing that matters is the way a monster who fed upon men's failures fell to a word that named their common shape. There are horrors that require iron and flame. There are horrors that end when a mind holds steady and says the right thing once. The people of Thebes carved the tale into their memory. They put the rock into their stories the way a farmer puts a boundary stone into the soil. They remembered the figure upon it, and the riddle that draws a man's whole measure in a handful of words. The poets in later years called the Sphinx a daughter of the old serpent mother, and they were pleased with the neatness of such a line. For monsters akin to other monsters in the songs that drink the dark, in the courts where the city weighed law against tears, judges would sometimes say that a quarrel had a sphinx in it when there was a question with only one door out. The wind still bleeds the rock clean on the days when the sun burns low, and shepherds still tell children to keep their answers close until they are sure. The years after the fall of Troy were years of wandering, and the sea that had once borne fleets now kept a single ship for company and then none. Among the many islands that lie scattered like bones across the wine, dark water, there was a green shore where sheep grazed in plenty and vines could grip the soil with ease. Odysseus beached his curved, proud ship there and took a party inland, thinking to barter for food and find the temper of the land. They found a cavern larger than any hall, with high roof ribbed by living rock and racks of cheeses set in patient rows. Baskets of curds stood beside pails of milk, and pens for lambs lined the walls. His men urged speed and theft, the taking of what hunger asked, and then a quick return to the ship. Odysseus's pride and a traveller's curiosity stayed his hand. He chose to wait for the master of that house and ask for gifts as custom demanded. The sun slipped from the cave mouth and the air changed, and then the shepherd came. He was Polyphemus, son of the earth shaker, a cyclops whose brow lifted like a cliff and whose single eye stared with the cold appraisal of a winter moon. He herded rams with a pine trunk for a staff, and he rolled a stone before the cave mouth that 20 yoke of oxen could not have moved. Hospitality is a thin reed in the mouths of monsters. The giant asked no names and heard no pleas. He seized 2 men as a man seizes hares from a snare and dashed them upon the ground, then ate them raw while the rest of the Greeks stood with bile in their throats. Morning brought the same, and evening brought the same. The cave became a slaughter yard, and the stone at the mouth was a law that would not bend. Odysseus looked upon the sheep and the pens and the hearth, and knew that strength would not break them free. He set his mind to work as a carpenter sets his hands upon a length of timber, and sees the whole shape hidden within it. There lay a great olive trunk, that the Cyclops meant to shape into a staff. Odysseus cut it to the length of a spear for giants, and smoothed it with a craftsman's care, then hardened the point in the fire until it glowed like a star seen through smoke. He hid it under dung and laid a plan inside his breast. When the shepherd returned at dusk, Odysseus offered him sweet wine from a jar won long before at Ismarus, red and heavy and fit to make a king forget his crown. The Cyclops drank as a child drinks, quickly and without count. He asked the guest his name, and Odysseus, who knew the value of a word well chosen, said that his name was Nobody, and that his father and mother had called him the same. The giant laughed, his head rolling on his shoulders, and promised to eat Nobody last, a favor that tasted like ash. Soon the wine wove chains around his limbs and he fell across the floor. Then the men took up the stake and drove it, turning it as men turn a ship's drill, into the single eye that watched them, and the point hissed in the wet and stank of burned flesh. The giant woke to a world that had gone dark, and he roared a storm that shook the island from cliff to beach. The other Cyclopes came to the cave mouth and called to know who harmed him, and Polyphemus shouted that nobody was killing him by trickery and by force together. They went away grumbling that if a god had struck him, then no man could help him. Dawn crept in and found the blinded shepherd squatting in the mouth of the cave, his hands on each ram's back as he let them out to pasture, feeling for the men who must try to rush past. Odysseus had bound each of his companions beneath the belly of a thick fleeced ram, 3 to a beast, and he himself clung to the underside of the great leader of the flock. The smell of lanolin and damp wool filled his lungs, and the air moved past with the slow patience of dawn. Polyphemus stroked the backs as they passed and missed the lives hidden underneath. They reached the light and ran for the ship and made the oars bite water with a will born of terror. Out on the swell, Odysseus felt the old pride rise, and it carried his voice to the rocks. He shouted his true name to the shore and boasted of the trick and the eye that was no longer an eye. Polyphemus tore a mountain top free and cast it. The sea leapt, and the ship staggered but lived. Then the Cyclops raised his hands and prayed to Poseidon, asking that the man who named himself Odysseus would never see his home, or if fate allowed him that sight, then that he come late and alone and to a house full of trouble. The god of the deep heard the prayer of his son. From that day the sea that lay between Ithaca and the long road home took on a different colour for those who rode in that ship. The men were silent while the shores slid by, and their captain, who had named himself to gain a thief's glory, tasted how sour a boast can turn when it is served back by a god. There are straits in the world where the water runs with a will of its own, and where cliffs listen for the cries of men. Circe, the daughter of Helios, had warned Odysseus of such a place, speaking of 2 perils that stood opposite each other, so that a ship must pass close to one and count the cost. To the right, from the eastward approach, rose a high rock where a cave opened midway up the face. In that cave dwelt Scylla, once a maiden loved by stories, and then remade into a thing that fed on sailors. She possessed 6 long necks, and upon each neck a head with triple rows of teeth that shone wet and white as a new forged blade. She kept 12 legs tucked in the shadow, and her bark sounded like the yelp of a whelp, though her hunger was a hunger that never left a bone clean. Across the channel on the other shore, the sea itself took a shape that men remembered in their bones. This was Charybdis, a moor that drank down the tide and spat it out again 3 times a day, and when she drank, the whirl would take a ship entire if it drifted too near. The choice lay before Odysseus, as it lies before every captain who steers more lives than his own. Circe told him that no weapon would avail against Scylla, and that it was better to lose a few than to lose all to the throat that opened in the sea. The men bent to their oars until the handles ran slick in their hands. Odysseus hid his fear under a sailor's commands, and took up his spear out of the same habit that makes a man reach for a cloak when wind rises. He could see the fig tree that clung to the cliff over the whirl and hear the slurp of the sea as Charybdis began to breathe. He kept the ship as close to Scylla's wall as he dared. The rock slid by, weeping cold, and the men stared toward the moor, thinking of the hole in the water that could swallow the whole of their lives. That was when the heads came down from the smoke-colored cave. They moved too quickly for eyes to reckon. 6 men lifted from the deck as easily as a woman lifts a child from the floor. Their feet kicked at the air and their hands clawed for the gunwales, and there was time enough for one cry from each throat before the stone hid them. Odysseus heard them call his name, and the sound followed him into every silence that came after. He stood fast because there was nothing else to be done. The ship shot the narrows with 6 oars empty, and the sea grew calm as if the water itself had forgotten what it had done. Later, after famine of judgment fell upon them on the island of the sun, and the men slaughtered the cattle of Helios, while their captain slept, and while warnings curled like smoke and were ignored, Zeus answered the sun god's plea. A squall fell upon the ship and broke it into planks, and the men went down among the white-tossed backs of waves until only their captain remained clinging to a spar. The sea took him back to that narrow place once more, and the whirl opened its throat beneath him. He rode the swell down into the dark, and then leapt for the limbs of the lone fig tree that grows from the cliff. There he clung, arms burning, while the sea drank and then belched the wreckage. When the water turned and the whirl loosened its jaw, he dropped like a stone into the foam and reached his raft before the next breath. The rock that held Scylla did not stir. Perhaps the thing that lived there slept. Perhaps it had dined well already and watched with lazy eyes. The survivor kicked free of the place with strokes that felt small as a child's in that great throat of the world. Odysseus washed ashore at the home of Calypso, and years ran like lines in sand under a tide. The tale of the men who died between the rock and the whirlpool did not lessen with time. Sailors who set their nets in calm bays and shepherds who walked paths along headlands told the story with the same careful pacing that men use when they name their ancestors. There is wisdom in such telling because it sets down a law that even kings must obey. There are straits where every choice costs blood. There are monsters that do not relent because a man is brave. There are days when the measure of a captain lies in losing only what the gods have already written, and in keeping his hands steady while the sea and the cliffs take their due. The hero who blinded a giant and named himself to the wind carried those lessons inside him when at last he came again to Ithaca's stones and found his house full of men who had forgotten what law is. When the ship of Jason was new, and the cedar of its ribs still smelled of the forest, when the figurehead of oak that held the speech of Zeus's own grove had not yet learned the names of the winds, the crew that the poets called the best of their age bent their backs together and pulled the Argo from the beach. The oars bit water, and the keel wrote its first line across the gulf. They were princes and sons of kings, and a few whose names had weight even among those, and each man carried a story upon his shoulders as a porter carries amphorae up a stair. The sea waited with the patience of a judge. Among the many landfalls of that voyage, there was a shore of Thrace, where an old man sat in a court without doors, and where hunger had driven dignity from his bones. This was Phineus, a seer whose sight had looked too often into the rooms of the gods. Zeus is a lord who keeps his counsel as a miser keeps his coin. The gift of prophecy is a cup that overflows in those who do not know when to set it down, and for this fault or for another like it, Phineus lost the light of his eyes. Blindness might have taught humility if the punishment had ended there. It did not. each time a meal was set before him, winged creatures came shrieking from the cloud line and took the food before his hands could find it. And what they did not take, they befouled so that a dog would turn away. The harpies were the name given to those tormentors, women in their faces and birds in their bodies, with talons that cut wood as easily as linen and a stink that trailed behind them like a curse. A king who goes long without eating loses the majesty of his speech. Phineas begged without shame when the Argo came to his strand. Jason promised relief as men promise rain when they carry water skins on their shoulders, and he set his company to watch. The old man reached for bread and smoke. Dark shapes stooped from the sky. They snatched and clawed, and the air filled with the sound of ripping. 2 of the Argonauts leapt as if loosed by a bowstring, for their father was the north wind and they had learned to use the sky as a road since boys. Zetes and Calais climbed upon the air with the ease that other men climb a ladder. They hunted the harpies across white caps and along the backs of the waves, and the bird women fled screaming toward the islands that lie where the Ionian becomes another sea. The sons of Boreas would have torn the offenders as a hawk tears a jay, but a rainbow broke from the clouds, and the goddess who walks upon it set her hand between hunter and prey. Iris gave the word of Zeus that Phineas would be troubled no more. In that oath, the chase ended. The harpies vanished toward their appointed place, and the winged men returned with their anger cooling like iron taken from the forge. A man who has been spared from starvation finds his tongue again. Phineas called for water and for a seat, and when his head cleared, he spoke the map the Argo required. There lay ahead a strait, where rock faces stood opposed like 2 warriors at the moment before they close. And those rocks met with a crash that broke timbers and syllables alike. They were the Symplegades, the clashing rocks, and no ship had gone through and then gone through again. The seer told Jason to launch a dove and to watch its tail. If the bird passed and left only a few white feathers in the seam where stone met stone, then the Argo might follow upon the same breath. If the bird died a sudden death between those jaws, then the crew should lay the ship up and go home to their mothers. Jason listened with the attention a condemned man gives to a reprieve. He put the dove into the air, and it flashed between the walls of black basalt. The cliffs slammed shut, and the tail lost a few quills to the pinch that would have broken a mast in 2. Then the gap opened as a mouth opens to speak. The men bent to the oars until their backs burned, and the goddess in the prow cried out in the voice of an oak grove. When a strong wind passes through it, the ship slid through, and the closing stones sheared a little from the ornament of the stern. Behind them the Symplegades grew still and fixed forever, as if the Argo's passage had taught them their limits. The crew rested on their oars and gulped air as men do who have been given their lives back. The sea beyond lay wide and green, and the road to the far east opened its long palm. Past capes that know other languages, and past shores where gods have different names, the Argo came at last to the river mouth that leads to Ea, the city of Colchis, where King Aeetes ruled under a standard of the war god whose grove stood dark and rich beyond the walls. There the prize hung like sunrise caught upon bark, a fleece of a ram that had once borne a child and his sister across the water to a place of safety. In Colchis, a father and a king are the same word, and Aeetes received Jason with the cold courtesy that a host gives to a guest he will test before he trusts. The stranger asked for the golden fleece as if asking for a train of mules at market. The king did not refuse with his mouth. He named the price, Jason would yoke bronze-footed bulls that breathed fire from their nostrils and plough the field of Ares. He would sow that field with dragon teeth taken from a storied hoard. He would stand his ground when armed men sprang from the furrows, born full-grown and eager to kill the hand that planted them. Only then would the gate of the grove open and the fleece be his. No man takes on such work without the favour of a god or a woman who has the ear of a god. The daughter of Aeetes walked beneath the moon with torches that hissed and spat when she lifted them. Medea knew the ways of herbs and the soft parts of a spell where a word can turn a mind. Some say love came into her as a fever. Some say Hera and Athena bent her toward the stranger, because the old houses sometimes choose instruments rather than leave the world to chance. Whatever stirred in her, she went to Jason in the night and told him how to live past morning. She anointed his flesh with an ointment that turned fire as rain turns off a tiled roof, and she taught him the trick that would make brothers out of enemies long enough to kill one another. Jason stood in the field at dawn while the bulls hammered the ground and snorted smoke that carried the taste of iron. He took them by the horns and drove the yoke home, and the plough bit earth as though it had waited, and the furrows ran straight across the god's acre. He cast the teeth into the dark soil, and men came up from the ground like the crop that war always brings. He remembered the counsel of the king's daughter and threw a heavy stone among them. They turned their heads as one, each thinking the other had struck at him, and the ranks fell to fighting in a ring that drew tight until there were no living men left to claim the field. The task set by Aeetes had been done in the sight of all, and the city spoke in the streets as cities always do when an unimagined thing has suddenly taken place. The king did not call for the keys to the sacred grove. A father's pride and a ruler's fear mixed into a draught that tastes like treachery when it is poured. Medea came again in the thin hour before dawn and said the time for courtesy had ended and the time for taking had come. She led Jason beyond the city and into the grove where trunks rose like pillars and where old blood had watered the roots for generations. Around the oak that bore the fleece a serpent lay coiled in many loops, a thing that did not blink and that never closed its mouth. The breath from it was as cold as the back of a cave, and its eyes had learned to see in that kind of dark that even the gods do not love. Medea sang and sprinkled drops from a cup that she had brewed in a place that men do not enter. The serpent's neck grew heavy, and the lids dropped and rose and dropped again and did not rise. Jason climbed the coils as a man climbs a stair and cut the golden pelt from the bough with careful hands. The fleece streamed over his arm like flowing grain, and the hair of it caught starlight and gave it back. They ran through the trees together, while the city dreamed, and the ship rocked at her anchor, and the sailors laid hands upon their weapons without knowing why. What followed is told by many mouths, and each puts its own weight upon the scales. Some say the king came howling after them with chariots, and that a brother of Medea met his end in the tangle of channels and islands out at sea, and that the pieces of him cast upon the water slowed the father who stopped to gather them. Some say the goddess of the ways sent a mist, and the Argo slid from the river mouth like a fox slipping a hound. All say that the ship turned her beak toward home with a cargo that would buy kingdoms and that would doom a house. The long road back had its own monsters waiting upon it. At Crete, a bronze man named Talos strode the beach each evening and counted the ships as a sentry counts prisoners. His life ran through a single vein that was closed with a pin at the ankle. There are tales that say the sorceress set a madness in him, and that he gashed his own limb upon a rock when he tried to throw stones. There are tales that say the pin was plucked as a child plucks a thorn from a rose. The ichor ran out as wine runs from a skin, and the giant fell with a sound that shook the sand. The Argo passed and did not look back. When the keel felt Greek sand again, the men leapt into the surf like boys and kissed the ground, and they drew their prize to a place of safety. The goddess who owns the bright shield would one day hang that fleece in a tale told to children in winter, but for a time it shone in the hands of those who had risked the jaws of rock and the sting of fire and the one serpent that does not sleep. The cost of their taking would be counted in other books and on other altars. The world is rarely finished with men who have done such things. Yet in the reckoning of monsters, this voyage had taken two from the board, the snatchers who had fed on a blind king's weakness, and the vigilant thing that had watched a holy tree since the first night, when men learned to make a field their own. The sea remembered the sound of oars that moved with a single mind, and the cliff faces along the Bosporus remembered the ship that taught them to stand still. The age of heroes had carried fire into lairs and had measured men against creatures that wore the masks of an older world. In the seasons that followed, the noise of claws upon stone faded, and the night learned a quieter breath. The old storytellers named this the dimming of the monstrous brood. They said the earth grew weary of bearing such births, or that the gods who had once spared Echidna for the proving of mortals judged the proving complete. There is a darker whisper that greatness in men demands an answering darkness, and that when the names of Perseus and Theseus and Heracles had settled into the memory of cities, the earth drew back its terrors as a woman draws back a hand from a fire that has already done its work. There were endings that felt like judgments spoken in small voices. In one telling the many-eyed watcher who never slept walked the lonely gullies of Arcadia and found Echidna within her cave after a long hunt that had learned the scent of venom and the glow of a banked coal. Argus Panoptes stood at the mouth and waited until her lids grew heavy. Then he went in and set steel where scale meets softness, and the light went out of that hidden hall. Other mouths say the mother of monsters outlived many winters and simply thinned into story while her children died in daylight. What the land remembers is that the brood no longer multiplied, and that men who took the old roads did not feel the same press of eyes upon their backs. The gods finished labors that heroes had begun. The giants who had once heaved mountains in a war that rattled the bones of the world did not rise again. Enceladus had a tomb of stone, and the tremor beneath Sicily was his turning when dreams troubled him. Polybotes lay under Nisyros, where the sea had broken, and a new island had come up like a shield from the floor. There were ash columns above Etna that wrote the same story in smoke each season. For men said the storm child who had almost unseated Zeus was pinned under that cone, and that fire is a language he cannot stop speaking. Where earth shook and fire climbed, Greeks pointed and named ancient bodies underfoot, and so they taught their children that the ground itself remembers struggle. The scattered hunt of lesser terrors went on in the years between wars of men. Theseus met the sow that rooted in the Crommyonian hills and left fields as ragged as battlefields, and he put an end to her wallowing. In Calydon, a boar sent by an angry goddess ploughed the orchards into ruin, until Meleger and a company of princes drove spears through bristle and skin, and then spoiled their fame with a quarrel that the Furies remembered. In Marathon, a wayward bull from Crete learned the edge of an Attic altar, and the blood that ran from its neck withered the last pride of a distant king. Heracles returned the hound of Hades to its master, and closed again the border that separates light from shadow. The Hydra's black blood lived on in arrowheads that did the work of justice and vengeance both. and in the end that stain walked back into the life of the archer who had first drawn it from the marsh, which is the way of every poison taken up in the cause of victory. Sea roads learned a different silence. There were still narrow places where oars rose and fell under the eyes of cliffs, and fishermen still murmured of sounds like whelps barking from a cave. Yet ships piled higher cargoes and named the strait a passage rather than a tomb. The one-eyed shepherd on his far pasture counted his rams and nursed a grudge that poets later softened into a love song for a sea nymph who would never come. The dragon that had watched over the apples of evening lay heaped in a forgotten grove, while in the east the coils beneath the tree of the war god loosened the day. Medea's song drained the will from muscles that had never slept. The world kept a few dreadful places on its map where a traveller's tongue went dry, yet the balance had shifted. Men told their sons that courage and craft had made a new weather, and that monsters now lived more often in the mouths of singers than in the mouths of caves. Victory over such creatures does not end with a carcass and a cheer. The Greeks set their triumphs into stone and bronze, so that the walls themselves would carry memory. On the metopes of temples where smoke rose in blue threads, a man in a lion's skin pinned a many-headed serpent while a boy brought fire to the stump. A youth with a coiled thread at his belt thrust a blade into a massive shape, half man and half bull. A rider on a winged horse stooped with a spear toward a beast whose breath had melted more than one farm. These carved squares taught the body a grammar of courage, each scene a sentence that named terror, and answered it with the stance of a single figure who did not look away. Potters drew the same lessons around cups passed from hand to hand in halls and under vines, so that drinkers saw again the mirrored shield and the sleeping sisters, and the head that made silence in a crowd of braggarts. The sky learned to keep the ledger as well. The hide of the Nemean cat that no knife could open was lifted among the stars, and became the lion that treads the path of summer. The crab that Hera sent to pinch a hero's ankle glittered in a ring of faint lights, and crawled westward as years turned. The coil that guards a northern pole took the name of the dragon who held the bright fruit, and its long body weaves through constellations as if still climbing a tree that has no fruit left on it. The water serpent that stretches across the southern night carried the memory of a swamp and of smoke that sealed wounds. The sea learned a monster's outline too, and when autumn rises a long shape lifts above the horizon that recalls a princess chained to a rock and a stone cliff lengthened forever by a single glance. The Greeks raised their eyes and read in the dark the same tales they had told at the fire, and in that reading the old battles became calendars and ways to count the seasons. Language kept what stone and star could not hold. To say a man sailed between Scylla and Charybdis became a way of naming a choice that will cost blood on either side. To call a tangle, a hydra taught the listener that wrong strokes make the trouble grow. A proud boast that offends a god became a simple word that schoolboys could speak, and yet the story of the queen who measured her beauty against the daughters of the sea still warned every household that a single sentence can drown a city. When men spoke of a chimera in later years, they meant a dream with many heads that can never breathe. But the oldest hearers felt heat upon the face at that word and smelled singed hair. The riddling strength of the mind which faced a lion-bodied judge taught cities to honor an answer spoken without a drawn sword, and the hall where law was weighed learned to ask whether a quarrel had a single door through which truth might pass. As the last wild bodies fell silent, the gods arranged the world of men with fewer eruptions from the deep past. The stories did not end, they changed rooms. Heroes who had hunted in marsh and cave were recalled upon winter nights and at spring festivals when bulls bellowed and blood smoked upon altars. Children who would never smell the den of a cat that drinks the light still played at wrestling in cloaks with shaggy hoods, and still asked elders to tell once more of the cave with two mouths and of the torch that taught next to learn a lesson. In theatre and hymn and painted clay, the monsters lived a second life, tamed into meaning yet still carrying a trace of the old fear that makes the heart beat hard. That fear is a teacher. It reminds the living that order is won, and that it can be lost, and that the earth keeps old rooms under our floors where anger and hunger wait. So the twilight came on, and did not quench every ember. The mountain at Sicily still groaned, and cast stars of fire into a night wind. A reef still pretended to be a living thing when a storm came round a headland and made teeth of the waves. A cave on a far shore still housed a shepherd who counted his flock by touch and muttered a name to the sea that would never answer him kindly. Yet in the lands that mattered to the songs, the great hunt was over, and the tools of that work were hung up where children could see them and ask their names. The house of Zeus held its order. The cities learned to fight wars where the foe bore a human face. The monsters who once taught men what courage feels like had been carried into the stars and into the laws and into the sayings that sharpen a mind. Their bones lay under mountains or in forgotten groves, but their shapes ruled an invisible kingdom that began at sunset and ended when the roosters woke. When the noise of claws faded and the island ceased to wake to the sound of wings over stone, the work of memory began in earnest. Cities laid claim to heroes as a farmer lays claim to a boundary oak, and the places where monsters had fallen became stations in a new geography of pride. Shrines rose upon promontories and near river mouths, small houses of stone where fishermen left oil and where shepherds poured wine for the shade of a man who had once stood against a thing born from the dark. In the hills above Trozen, and on the roads about Thebes, and in the bends of the river that feeds Tiryns, ordinary folk kept the names, and by keeping them, gave those names a second life. There were festivals where boys in lion skins wrestled in sand, and where elders retold the shaping of the club and the lesson that fire taught the necks of serpents. There were altars where a city asked favor of a prince who had faced a riddle and had given his people a season of peace. This was how the age of monsters lingered, through 1,000 small acts of recall and 1,000 quiet bargains with the dead. The poets fixed the lines as masons fix courses of stone. They took the old stories that had travelled from mouth to mouth under olive trees and set them to verse, so that a tale would cross the sea with the same weight it had carried at home. Homer sang of a one-eyed shepherd and a captain who learned the price of pride upon the open water, and in that singing he made a law for those who sail. Hesiod took up the births of gods and the begetting of terrors, and taught men to hear in thunder and earthquake the footprint of a quarrel that began before human memory. Later, other voices shaped the same clay with different hands. Tragedians summoned the Sphinx to a city stage and made a people watch again the moment when a single answer can change the course of a kingdom. The stories grew deeper lines with each telling, until even the places that did not know the smell of those old lairs felt the pull of the past. Cults of heroes followed the paths that soldiers and merchants cut. A town that raised walls in a foreign valley would set a stone to a protector whose deeds were older than the town itself. colonists from Euboea and Corinth and Megara carried the names with them as they carried seed and salt, and far on new shores they traced in the dust the thread that Theseus once held in his hand. In Athens, the bones of Theseus were brought home with ceremony and set in a house that bore his name, and every oath sworn upon that place tied present to past as a rope ties ship to quay. In many lands, Heracles received libations as a god because the labour of a mortal who has walked into the mouth of death and returned sits very near to the throne of divinity. So the line between man and God learned to blur at the edges, and in that blur the Greeks taught themselves that courage and craft are forces the world honours even when the body fails. The learned took up a different task. They weighed the stories as a magistrate weighs a case, with patience and with a suspicion of delight. Some said that a monster was a man in armour glimpsed through smoke and fear, that a caravan of foreign beasts had spiralled into legend as easily as a vine climbs a column, that a whirlpool had taken the shape of a hungering mouth because the mind seeks faces in storms. Others said that the earth is older than reason, and that it keeps old rooms beneath our feet where shapes with too many heads once lay at ease. Between those two houses the tale endured and lost nothing of its savour. To hear a rhapsode under a summer sky was to feel again the cold breath of a cave and the weight of a mountain that presses down upon a name which will never be spoken kindly. To watch a play at the spring festival was to learn that the enemies of a city can be born within a family, and that some of the worst monsters carry a familiar face. In the first wars of Olympus, the world heard thunder give law to chaos, and in the last hunts of the heroes, the world learned how men take that law into their hands. Between those two lessons lies the measure that the Greeks used whenever they looked from altar to street. The gods stood above with their quarrels and their counsels, with favours that could turn a boy into a killer of lions, and with offences that could turn a girl into a weapon against her own house. Men stood below with their short lives and their long memories. Monsters walked the ground between as trials that taught both parties their limits. When Typhon shook the roots of mountains, Zeus learned that even a sky king can falter and must gather himself with care. When Heracles strangled a lion in the dark and brought a hound into daylight by his grip alone, mortals learned that the law thrown down from heaven can be carried forward by human hands and human will. What remained after the last layer went silent was a way of seeing. A strange fire on a ridge was not only a warning to flee, it was also the rumour of a giant turning in his tomb, and a reminder that the safety of cities is never a gift that lasts without tending. A sheer-sided gulf in a strait where the tide throws itself about like a horse can teach a captain that some choices always carry loss, and that the art of rule is the art of steering with the least death that the day will allow. A prince who follows a thread into the heart of a puzzle where a beast waits teaches a citizen that law is a line which must be traced through darkness with steady fingers. A rider who climbs upon a winged horse shows a court that a man who lifts himself too high will pay for it, even if he once saved a valley from fire. A youth who uses a mirror to face a face that cannot be faced teaches a generation that the mind can fashion tools which strength alone cannot match. The Greeks set these measures into their customs. When a child first shouldered a small spear at a festival, the elder who placed it there spoke the name of a man who had once done something difficult and had done it cleanly. When a city gathered for judgment in a shaded stoa, the men who argued and the men who listened held in their thoughts the shape of a riddle and the cost of a wrong answer. When ships were named and launched, the names often reached back to journeys where a figurehead had warned a crew and where a dove had flown a narrow course ahead of a keel. The constellations that old men taught to boys on clear nights were more than lanterns hung in a cold hall. They were a ledger of labours and a restatement of laws. To speak the name of the lion in summer was to remember a set of hands closing about a great throat, and to remember that some victories require a silence afterward in which a man gathers himself. In the end, the monsters served a use that even the gods could respect. They were the places where an age tested its own metal. The proof marks lay everywhere in Greece, from the ring of hills around Argos to the bleak headlands of Epirus and the threshing narrows where two seas meet. A generation that had watched those tests pass into stone and song learned to carry itself with a kind of steadiness that came from blood and story together. Later ages wore the tales as ornaments and debated them in schools where boys recited until the daylight faded. Yet even then the old fear kept a small room in each heart. It spoke when the earth shook and the lamps swayed. It spoke when a ship listed and the stars slipped. It spoke when a judge faced a hard case, and when a girl stood before an altar and prayed for the life of her lover who was setting sail at dawn. So the Book of Terrors closes as a ledger closes at season's end. There are sums that will never be exact, and there are losses that cannot be made whole. The gods still keep their distant halls, and men still cross fields in the dark with a hand open for the latch of a gate. Between them lies the work of courage. The Greeks taught it with the shapes of creatures that no longer walk, and with the deeds of men who no longer breathe, and in that teaching they left behind a map that stretches from cave mouth to palace door, and from the bitter foam at a strait to the quiet inner court of a shrine. Whoever takes that map in hand will see that the path runs forward as well as back.